Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. As you can see, I am joined by Tim of Christian Concern. And today we're going to be doing a general sort of discussion around the issue of whether Islam is intrinsically anti-Semitic. Now, we obviously know that there are Muslims who are anti-Semitic, just like there are Christians who are anti-Semitic, just like there are ethno-nationalists who are anti-Semitic. And so we're not discussing whether particular believers have anti-Semitism. What we want to look at is whether the corpus of doctrine, values, and worldview as imbibed in the Islamic text sources, that's the Qur'an, the Hadith, Tafsir, and other sources of Sharia law, which includes principles of fiqh, whether they could be accurately described as intrinsically anti-Semitic. And Tim is going to be making well, we're going to be talking about it, and I'll let you kick off the conversation, Tim. But as we always do before we do these kinds of talks, let's start with a prayer. And Tim, you've chosen a psalm. If you want to read that all the way through as our opening prayer, and then we'll begin.
Yeah, Psalm 13, one of my favorite Psalms. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I've overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me.
And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, Tim, do you want to kick us off then on this question of whether Islam is anti-Semitic?
Sure, let's do that. Right. So the question is Islam anti-Semitic? The question, as you said, is not about Muslims, whether they are anti-Semitic. It's about Islam. Islam should be judged according to its text, the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sirah or the biographies. I intend to demonstrate that Islam, as defined by its text, is anti-Semitic. So let's kick off with some quotations from the Quran. Surah 5, verse 51 says, O ye who believe, take not the Jews and Christians for your friends and protectors. They are but friends and protectors to each other, and he amongst you that turns to them for friendship is of them. Verily, Allah guideth not a people unjust. Look at that then, clearly, a very clear instruction, command even, to Muslims. You are not to take Jews and Christians as your friends. Later on in the same surah, 564, it says this, I'm talking about the Jews again, we have cast among them animosity and hatred until the day of resurrection. Every time they kindle the fire of war against you, Allah extinguished it, and they strive through the land, causing corruption, and Allah does not like corrupters. Notice it says there, animosity and hatred until the day of resurrection. That's right throughout time, including today. Animosity and hatred. That's anti-Semitic. Here's another one, 582. You will surely find the most intense of people in animosity towards the believers to be the Jews and those who associate others with Allah, and the nearest of infection to be those who say we're Christians and so on. The future tense there is important. You will surely find. It's not saying just today, it's saying in the future as well. The most intense people in animosity to be the Jews. 3 times in the Quran, the Jews are cursed as apes and pigs, or apes or pigs. Here's one of those examples from Surah 7, 166 to 167. So, talk about the Jews. When they were insolent about that which they had forbidden, we said to them, be apes, despised. And mention when your Lord declared that he would surely continue to send upon them until the day of resurrection those who would afflict them with the worst torment. Notice again, it's saying until the day of resurrection, that people would be sent who would afflict them with the worst torment. That's talking about the Jews. That is clearly anti-Semitic. Then let's look at Surah 9:29. Fight against those who do not believe in Allah or in the last day, or do not consider unlawful what Allah and his messenger have made unlawful, and do not adopt the religion of truth, that is Islam, from those who are given the scripture, which means Jews and Christians. Fight until they give the jizya tax willingly while they are humbled. So it's fighting against, in particular, those who are given the scripture, which means Jews and Christians, and they are to fight until they pay the jizya, which is a subjugation tax for non-Muslims, and until they're humbled or humiliated in some translations. Clearly anti-Semitic again. Surah 60, verse 4 says this: we've denied you, talking about the Jews, and there has appeared between us and you animosity and hatred forever. Forever. Notice that, forever. This carries on forever. I could quote many other verses from the Quran, but that will do for now. Looking into the Hadith, the most famous one is called the Apocalyptic Hadith. It occurs in both Bukhari and Muslims' collections of Hadith. It says this: Allah's Messenger said, which means Muhammad said, the hour will not be established until you fight with the Jews, and the stone behind which a Jew will be hiding will say, O Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, so kill him. Clearly apocalyptic, clearly saying, referencing Jews in particular, clearly anti-Semitic. This hadith is cited in the Hamas Charter, Article 7, to justify Hamas's anti-Semitism. A 2011 poll found that 73% of Palestinians agreed with this hadith. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Mufti Muhammad Hussein, expressed his own agreement with this hadith in a sermon in 2012. Moving on to the Sirah, in the biography, Muhammad personally ordered the beheading of 600 plus Jewish men who had surrendered to him. That is religious genocide or ethnic cleansing in today's parlance. Muhammad also said, I will expel the Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula and leave not any but Muslim. In another context, kill any Jew that falls into your power. He committed ethno-religious cleansing of the whole area where he lived. So in conclusion, I think we can all agree that this material is Islamic and it's anti-Semitic, comes from the revered texts of Islam. Therefore, I submit to you that Islam is anti-Semitic.
I mean, I think there's a very clear case there that certainly Islam has an anti-Semitic narrative that can be tapped into. So, for instance, like the kind of defenses that Muslims will give will try to put it in its context, and that, well, in its context, they'll try to say that, you know, the Jews betrayed Muhammad. They had treaties with Muhammad, and these treaties were of non-aggression, and pacts of solidarity, and so when Muslims, so when the Jews betrayed Muhammad, Muhammad was justified in his actions, but these were only for Muhammad's time. They're not values that Muslims have to embody today. They're just what Muhammad did at his time. So how would you reply to that?
I think there's a number of responses to that, but one is to say that Muhammad is meant to be the perfect example for all time, and the Quran is also, you know, the text from heaven revealed for all time as well. So, you know, relativizing it in that way is kind of the kind of thing that, you know, traditional Orthodox mainstream Islam would just not do. They would just say, this is the eternal Quran. Who are you to say I know better than that? Who are you to say that only applies at that time or that particular way or this particular thing? So yeah, that's one point to make. The other point is that the texts I've cited are ones that say until the day of resurrection, forever, this kind of thing that cannot be relativized to just these particular Jews at that time. This is saying Jews forever, and the apocalyptic hadith in particular is saying, you know, at the end times, you know, you'll end up, you know, you'll be killing Jews, and stones will cry out, kill a Jew because there's one hiding behind me. You know, this is clearly anti-Semitic. It's not just saying these particular Jews at this particular time. It's saying all Jews, and there are various other verses saying they're cursed and so on as well. So I think that's very, very difficult to sustain. And on the question of a treaty, I mean, you know, there was the Charter of Medina, which is recorded in the Sirah, which looks relatively sort of benign in terms of, oh, to the Jews, your religion, to Muslims, their religion, and so on. But what did you have 5 years later? According to Islamic sources, basically no Jews anywhere living in Medina ever again. You know, so, you know, this charter with the Jews that's meant to give them protection and agreement didn't work. And as to whether they actually violated the treaty, well, there were 3 tribes in Medina. The Bena Kainuka was the first one that Muhammad expelled. And before anything else happened, he threatened them with breaching, he threatened them with, you know, have you not seen what happened to the Bena Qurayshi, which was the tribe back in Mecca. So he basically threatened them and provoked them and argued, which he was not supposed to do according to that charter. So he broke that charter first. In the other case, the Banu al-Nadir, who were also expelled, Muhammad said, "Oh, I had a dream, and they were plotting to drop a rock on my head. I mean, that was therefore you've violated the treaty because I had a dream." Yeah, I had a
That was
dream.
the reason for expelling
Yes,
that tribe, is because of a dream.
yes, I had a dream that you're plotting against me. Therefore, you're plotting against me. Therefore, I have the right to expel you, and fight against you. So, how you claim that they were the ones to do it, and the Banu Qurayza, the last one, who were exterminated. I mean, they were accused of plotting again with the Meccans, but that's an accusation, and I don't know if there's any actual evidence of that. So yes, I think these claims are very difficult to sustain, even in their own merits at that time as well.
I think one of the things that usually highlights well the sort of anti-Semitic nature of it is if you just reverse it. So, for instance, if the president, name me a dictator that's alive at the moment,
Putin.
okay, yeah. So if Putin decided, right, I've had a dream that Muslims are plotting against me, that they're gonna blow me up in my car, therefore all Muslims are now expelled from the Russian Federation, right across the entire
It's crazy, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah, right across
Yeah.
the entire Muslim world, everyone would rightly be crying out Islamophobia.
Yep.
And yet Mohammed is doing what, for instance, the Burmese government has done to the Rohingya Muslims.
Yep.
And yet when the Burmese government does it to the Rohingya Muslims, it's Islamophobic, it's prejudice. But when Mohammed does it to the Jews, it's not. And I don't see how they can sort of like get around that comparison. I debate Muslims all the time, and they'll point out to me things like the Spanish conquistadors and the Spanish kings, the Spanish monarchy that forced out the Moriscos from Spain after the liberation of Spain during the Reconquista. And they call that they describe it as a hateful act. They describe it as a terrible act, as an Islamophobic act, and yet that's exactly what Muhammad has done to these Jewish tribes. And so when
Yeah.
it is done to Muslims, it's Islamophobia. But when Muhammad does it to
The
Jewish
Jews.
tribes, it's not
Yeah.
anti-Semitism.
It's a very good point. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. It's a very good way of illustrating it and explaining. And the attempts to justify this kind of thing, by relativizing it or by trying to make excuses in terms of what actually was happening in the history of Islam just don't work. I just don't think they work.
Yeah, and I think that you've got this this fact that in the Quran, when it talks about fighting against the Jews and the Christians until they paid the jizya.
Yeah.
Well, for me, there's two issues there. Firstly, you've got the fact that the reason for the waging of the war isn't because the Jews or the Christians betrayed Muhammad. It's because they are Jews or Christians.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if it was,
no, you're right. There's no reason given there other than they are people of the book. They are the people of Scripture. They are the people who don't believe me. Basically, isn't it? You don't believe me. You don't accept me as a prophet. And then whereas Muhammad didn't fight when he was in Mecca and didn't have enough power to fight, when he got into Medina and gained more power and more people, he turned to fighting and aggression.
Yeah.
He actually threatened aggression in Mecca, and they were pretty shocked and appalled that he would do that, but he didn't carry it out there. So yes, and then you end up with these three options for Jews and Christians, which is convert, die, or accept dhimmi status, subjugation status, where you pay this extortion subjugation tax, the jizya tax, and you have to wear distinctive clothing, and you can't build any new mosques or synagogues, and you can't any synagogues or churches rather, and you have to be in deference to any Muslim. You can't be in authority over any Muslim in any context, and your voice is not recognized in court, and so on and so on. And it's basically like an apartheid system, really, against Jews and Christians.
And again,
and that's what the historical record shows, that's what they actually did.
Oh yes, absolutely. And I think again in terms of highlighting that, if you just ask Muslims, like, okay, let's imagine that, because right now we've got the rise of right-wing governments around Europe, right-wing parties around Europe. If we imagine that an extreme right-wing government managed to establish itself in the Netherlands,
Mm,
that stripped Muslim citizens of the Netherlands of half of all of their rights,
mm.
and made them legally less able to live out a full life than a non-Muslim, would that Muslim call that government Islamophobic?
Oh,
Undoubtedly,
absolutely. I mean, of
undoubtedly,
course
yeah.
they would. Yeah, of course they would. And again, the idea of kind of relativizing this, which I've seen some people do, and say, "Oh, they had special protected status." You couldn't attack the Jews and Christians; they had special protected status. Protection from what?
Hmm. From
Protection
who?
from what? Is protection from being killed by Muslims,
Yeah.
on pain of not converting. You pay the jizya tax, and very often in the traditions, they would actually, smack you on the neck, and give you a thump, and you had to kneel down and bow down and be smacked on the neck as a symbol of, like, if you hadn't paid this, you would be killed.
And that's descriptions of how the jizya was collected in Spain, isn't it?
Yes, and various other places. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and one of the other defenses that I often hear around the jizya tax is that Muslims say, "Oh well, Christians pay the jizya tax, and Muslims pay the zakat, and so it's just that you pay
Well,
the jizya and we pay the zakat, and so therefore, you're not being treated badly or any differently."
so zakat is 5%, isn't it? It's
2.5%.
sorry, 2.5%. Yeah. And one of the five pillars of Islam. And but jizya originally was like 50% of your income.
It could go up to 50%. Yeah.
And then it was other extortionate huge amounts.
Mhm.
And there are accounts of people paying this tax. And of course, the wealthiest Jews could pay it. And but they had to do this whole symbolic ritual of handing it over and bowing down and being hit over the head and all this stuff. And then the poorest Jews couldn't pay it, and no exceptions were given, and no possibilities were given, and they would just be brought along. And if they couldn't pay it, they'd be killed. And that's what happened. And every
Mm.
year they would do this, no exceptions ever allowed. The Quran is or the traditions are very explicit about that. You cannot make any exceptions for jizya. They must all pay it, and they did on pain of death. Yeah.
What other sort of evidences can you bring forward to, demonstrate that Islam is intrinsically anti-Semitic?
Well, I would go. I mean, there are other verses in the Quran, lots of them. There are also other hadith, things like "Do not greet Jews and Christians." Muhammad saying, "May Allah's curse be on Jews and Christians because they build places of worship at the graves of their prophets." You've got "No Muslim would die, but Allah would submit in his stead a Jew or a Christian in hellfire." You've got all those kind of stuff. And another hadith saying, he heard some sound. He said that's the Jews being tormented in their graves. Another hadith saying the Antichrist or the Ajal will be followed by 70,000 Jews. Another hadith says Jews are mutated into rats. Jews cause meat to rot. All this kind of stuff is there. And then you've got the most interesting one to me from the Quran, which is not obvious, but it's obvious when you look at how it's interpreted, is Surah 1:7, which is actually one that's recited in the 5 daily prayers when they pray 5 times a day. And Surah 1:7 talks about guide us not on the straight path, the path of those who bestowed favor. Guide us along the straight path, the path of those upon you who you say bestowed favor, not on those who've earned your anger or those who've gone astray. And the traditional interpretation, which is related from Bukhari's collection of hadith, clearly says that those who earn your anger are the Jews, and those who've gone astray are Christians. And you've got many other interpreters who agree that that's what it means there, many other theologians as well. And this gets preached in sermons. There's a sermon in New Connecticut in a mosque in November just last year. The Imam said, Muslims recite this first chapter of the Quran 17 times a day in their 5 daily prayers in order to be reminded of Allah's anger towards the Jews. In just last month, in April, in a sermon in Fort Lauderdale in Florida, the Imam said, according to the Quran, who are those whom Allah is upset or angry with? The Jews, followed by the misguided ones who are the Christians. And it clearly says that's who we're praying about. That's what we're saying when we pray this prayer. We're being reminded every day about how Allah's wrath and anger rests on the Jews. I mean, so 17 times a day they're reminding themselves of the wrath of Allah against the Jews.
But I mean, I can, if I sort of channel my inner Muslim, my inner Reza Aslan, I would say that, like, well, that's God being angry with the Jews or the Christians. That doesn't mean that Islam, i.e. the Muslims, are intrinsically, and doesn't mean Muslims are intrinsically anti-Semitic. It's just Allah being...
That's hard to sustain, isn't it, Bob?
Well, go on then. I mean, tell us what's wrong with that defense.
We're praying, lead us on this path, not the path of those people who are the Jews who you're angry with, God. You're just reminding yourself every day of how God is angry with the Jews, and that's that anger persists to this day. So it's anti-Semitic to put it in that way, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I know that Christians do jump on this, but for me, it's not one of the strongest arguments, or at least we don't frame it very well. I think the way that we need to frame it in that sense is that because the Christians and the Jews are identified as going in the wrong direction, upon whom Allah's anger rests.
Yeah,
you've got to connect it to the fact that Muslims are supposed to hate what Allah hates and love what Allah loves.
Oh yeah,
and we miss that link in the chain.
Mm-hmm.
So that Muslims are to be angry for the sake of Allah. They're to love for the sake of Allah. They are to, to do everything for the sake of Allah. So those upon whom Allah's anger rests, according to Islamic belief, they need to, embody that in some way, that judgment in some way. And I think that there's a link in the chain of that argument that we need to make better to demonstrate.
Fair point. Yes. I mean, I think, I suppose I'm thinking it's obvious. I mean, because
it's not obvious.
Being a Christian, I interpret it that way because, if God is pleased with this kind of people, then I should be pleased with this kind of people. If God's angry with this, I should be angry with this as well, in the same kind of way. So yes, but perhaps it's not obvious to the observer. In the street in quite the same way. And I did say it's less obvious because the text itself in the Quran doesn't mention Jews. There you have to go to the Hadith.
You have to go to the tafsir to make that, because the text itself. And you've got to be wary of the text. You've got to be wary of the text not saying that, because a slippery apologist will basically use the fact that the text doesn't say something explicit as a get out. So you've really got to nail things like that down.
Sure.
I would.
But then you see, at the end of the day, Bob, you're asking me what other arguments have I got, and I can also go to theologians and also, lots of quotes from Islamic theologians or scholars, and then you can go to history as well and give lots of quotes from examples of Islamic anti-Semitism through history. But at the end of the day, I don't actually have to prove very much to show that Islam. All I need to say is there are certain texts in the Quran, in the Hadith, in the Surah, that are anti-Semitic, and that is the bottom line, right? Nothing else counts in a way. If I lose the argument on history or lose the argument on theologians or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Although it'd be very surprising if all the theologians didn't agree with what the text said, but they don't. But or if all the historical evidence was that Muslims weren't anti-Semitic, but the evidence is they were, but it's the text at the end of the day, that proves the point one way or another. And even if there are phallo-Semitic texts in the Quran, that doesn't matter either, because I don't have to prove that every text of the Quran is anti-Semitic. I just have to prove that there are texts in the Quran or the Hadith or the Surah that are anti-Semitic, and that are not limited to the Jew at that particular time and all that stuff. And then you've got it. There we are. We've proved that Islam is anti-Semitic.
And I think it's important to remember that if someone tries to jump to if you're trying to make this point in an argument and someone tries to jump to the Bible to reverse the argument. You need to just focus in on the question that you're discussing and not
Yeah,
allow
no,
them
I
to flip
agree. I
the
mean, I think,
script.
people will likely sort of say, well, if you're saying the Qur'an's anti-Semitic, the Bible is too. And, for the purposes of this question, well, why are you bringing the Bible into it? Because the question is Islam anti-Semitic, right? So, the Bible's got nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
Obviously one can very happily debate whether the Bible is anti-Semitic, and maybe we should do that another time, and clearly Jesus was Jewish Messiah and it's all written by Jews and all these other points, and there are many more points we can make about this. And I think it's quite easy to prove that the Bible is not anti-Semitic. And again, that's what my case rests on. If I have to prove the Bible's not anti-Semitic, I have to prove there are no fully anti-Semitic texts in the Bible, and I think that can be proven.
Yeah, I just want to come back to a couple of the points that you've made. It's ironic that Muhammad cursed the Jews and the Christians. Do you have what was that one? Because they built their churches and synagogues on the tombs of the prophets. What?
Yeah, that's a hadith, that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you got the reference? Have you got that one to quote?
Yep. Here we go. Here we go. Yes, Bukhari 456, 660.
Yeah.
May Allah's curse be on the Jews and the Christians, for they build places of worship at the graves of their prophets. And by that, he intended to warn the Muslim from what they, Jews and Christians, had done.
Because what you've got there is telling you something about Muhammad's heart.
Yeah.
That isn't Allah speaking.
Yeah.
That is Muhammad making a prayer to Allah about the Jews and the Christians, based upon Jewish and Christian practices.
Yeah.
Now, if I was to go, right, we should destroy all them, may God curse the Muslims because the Muslims wear the burqa, or God curse the Muslims because Muslims don't eat pork, right? I would be identifying something intrinsically Islamic and then praying that God curses them because of the way that they're expressing their faith. And that's telling you something about my heart and about my heart towards
that's a good point.
Muslim practices.
Yeah.
And for me,
and the one about he heard something and then said that's the Jews being tormented in their graves. That's similar, isn't it?
Well, a Muslim would just say that that's exactly what he heard. He heard the Muslims being tortured in their graves.
Yes, of course.
But so that's, for me, that's not a strong argument, that, because anything that is in terms of proving that Islam is intrinsically anti-Semitic,
right?
Bearing in mind, to some degree, this is a very modernist kind of conversation. Anything that's intrinsically metaphysical in that discussion is going to be a weaker point than something that has real, practical, observable, this world application.
Yeah, but it depends who you're arguing with, isn't it, Bob? Because if you argue with someone who's not a Muslim, they would laugh at that idea, as I just did, right? If you argue with a Muslim, then maybe they would actually make that point. Fair enough. I would probably still laugh at it, but it's and a non-Muslim listening to that would think, yeah, that's crazy.
Well, I would suggest that your strongest points are points that have real world impact. So, for instance, you've got the verse in the Qur'an that talks about don't take Jews and Christians as friends. Yeah. Right now, that has a very direct application. Don't take Jews and Christians as friends. If you were to preach a sermon in a church and it was to be released on YouTube in which you said, don't take Muslims as friends, people would be accusing you of Islamophobia.
Oh, absolutely, they would. Yeah.
So why is it not anti-Semitic, or in this case, even Christophobic, when Muhammad says, don't take Jews and Christians as friends?
And it's very interesting because this verse is not well known. I remember some years ago, Bob, I had some Israelis come to my house, and they fought in the IDF, as part of their national service, whatever. And I said, do you realize the Quran says, I can't remember how it came up, but it came out, do you realize the Quran says don't take Jews and Christians as friends? They're like, no, don't be silly, it doesn't say that. So I had to go and get a copy of the Quran for them and show them. And they couldn't believe it was a genuine Quran, you know. So
Yeah.
they just, you know, they were astonished that the Quran says this. They had no idea. And I thought, my goodness, you've actually been in the IDF and you don't know this. What is going on? You know, surely everyone in the IDF knows that.
No, it's because Israel is a liberal state. It's a liberal state like the UK and America. And so a lot of people in the culture, just like in the UK, are just very unaware of a lot of the things that we're talking about. Me and you are familiar with the material. Me and you are familiar with the history. Me and you are familiar with the stories of the martyrs and the confessors. But for lots of people, the only thing that they've ever been told are Islamophilic statements from their politicians and celebrities. And their only knowledge of any sort of Quranic verses or verses like, he who saves a single life saves the world entire, you know, which is a
Which is
total
a
rip-off.
misquote. Which
Yeah,
is a misquote.
Is it me misquoting? Is it the Quran misquoting?
You're misquoting it.
Yeah, go on, quote me properly. Do you remember? I can pull it up. I can find it.
No, I can. No, because it actually says we've ordained for the children of Israel.
Yes.
This is one interesting point, you know, that whoever kills a soul, no, it's got this exception there. Whoever kills a soul, unless for murder or spreading mischief in the land, it would be as if he slew the whole people, and if he saves a life, it would be if he saved the life of the whole people. Those words, by the way, are quotation from the Talmud. They're a Jewish tradition, which the Quran is just quoting there, and is saying this is what was ordained for the Jews. And then the very next verse says the penalty for those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger and strive upon the earth to cause corruption, which is the exception made in the previous verse. Remember, you know, whoever kills a person except for spreading mischief in the land or corruption, the penalty for that is execution or crucifixion or cutting off of hands and feet on opposite sides or exile from the land. And that is their disgrace in the world, and a heavy punishment is theirs in the hereafter. And so in that context, you've actually got a justification of execution. In the context where they misquote it and say the Quran says, if you kill someone, it's like you kill the whole world. Actually, the justification is there for execution or crucifixion of people who spread mischief in the land. And mischief in the land from other contexts is basically disobeying Allah, which is anyone who's not ultimately following Muhammad.
Well, yeah, the Tasfirs would describe us, me and you, as creating mischief in the land.
Yeah, no, exactly. And the Jews are clearly described as people who spread mischief in the land.
Because we're critics of Islam.
Yes.
You know? Yeah. And you know, like the only saving graces for any Islamist that might watch this is we're not in a land of a caliphate, and so we're not in Muslim land at the moment. We're in the land of we're in the Dar al-Harb, or the land of treaty, depending on which version of Sharia law you're following. But
just to say that, Surah 17, verse 4, we convey to the children of Israel in the scripture, that's the Jews, that you will surely cause corruption on the earth twice and surely reach a degree of great haughtiness. The same word that's used in 533 there, that the punishment for corruption is execution, crucifixion, or cutting of hands and feet.
So when you link those two together, you have a clear legal justification in Sharia law.
Yes.
Persecution and oppression of Jews.
Yes.
As well as Christians.
Yes.
You know, and I just want to actually go back to the point that Muhammad said about, you know, may Allah's curse be upon them because they build their churches and synagogues on the tombs of the prophets. Because the irony of irony is Muhammad's tomb in Medina is now a mosque. It's now a place where Muslims go to pray. So I just find that ironic that his own tomb has been turned into a mosque, and the Hadiths quoted. There is another point that you mentioned. You know, there's a Hadith that says if it wasn't for the Jews, that meat would rot. Could you quote that one for us? Yeah, you mentioned that one.
Yeah. So let's just find that one quickly. So this is from Sahih Bukhari 455-547. But for the Israelis, meat would not decay, and but for Eve, wives would never betray their husbands. So again, blaming Jews for meat decaying and for wives ever betraying their husbands as well. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's two there. You got to be careful, because Eve you know, like when a Muslim reads their own text, they try to read it a bit like a lawyer, you know,
Yeah.
and they
Yeah.
would go, well, no, that the Eve bit was not connected to the Jews. The Eve bit is about adultery in the world is because of Eve, despite the fact that Islamic sources say that Allah is the one that gives you the amount
No,
of
the text
adultery.
doesn't mention Eve, of course. Or the text just mentions the Israelis.
Oh, does it not mention Eve?
I don't think it does. No.
Have you got the text?
Yes.
Let's have a look at the text.
No, you're right. You're right. I've misread it. But for the Israelis, meat would not decay, and but for Eve, wives would not betray their husbands. You're right. Yes, no,
Yeah.
it does mention Eve. You're quite right.
But you've got this you know, the fact
Yeah.
you've got some interesting theological points that fall out of that. Firstly, it's a kind of nod. It diminishes Muslims' complaint against the idea of original sin. This idea
Yes.
that because
No. Yeah.
one group sinned, everyone suffers a consequence. So the reason,
Yeah.
apparently, according to that hadith, the reason why the meat in our fridges rots is because of the Jews.
Yeah.
You know, and that's, you know, like, even if it were true, which it's a very laughable idea that it is true, but
Yeah.
even if it were true, that would mean that Muslims admit that the sins of one person or one group of people can affect the whole of creation.
Yeah.
You know, so they have a similar concept to the fall there.
Yeah.
But what would you do if, you know, if a Muslim just turned around and said, look, you know, I don't believe this hadith, I don't believe that hadith. You know, if you threw these hadiths at them and they said, well, you know, when we don't really believe, are these sahih hadiths that you're reading, or are these da'if, or what's the grading of the hadiths?
Well, they're Bukhari and sometimes Muslim, which are the highest, respected hadith, particularly in the Sunni tradition. And the problem with not believing the hadith is, where do you get even the 5 pillars of Islam? You can't find them just in the Quran.
Yeah.
Right. So, the hadith are absolutely core to Islamic teaching and tradition. And certainly for any orthodox, traditional, mainstream Muslim, they see the hadith as authentic, authoritative sayings of Muhammad, authentic and authoritative. And so, mainstream traditional Orthodox Muslims would not just say, I don't believe that. Now, some modern Muslims are trying to say that. They're trying to revise Islam and cut out bits they don't like. And I would sort of say, why do you say you don't believe that? Presumably because it is anti-Semitic. But then you've lost your point, because this is an Islamic text, traditionally regarded as authentic and authoritative, and therefore, Islam is anti-Semitic. And of course, why does Hamas appeal to this hadith? Because it's authoritative.
Yeah. Hello. We seem to be having.
And they know that Muslims will, therefore that must be true, and therefore I should, believe accordingly and behave accordingly and think the same. And so, the authority is absolutely there. And if any particular Muslim might say, I don't believe these hadith, fine, in a sense, good for you. But that is not what mainstream traditional Orthodox Islam teaches or believes or says.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would draw out is the fact that if you read could you read the apocalyptic hadith?
Yeah. Just go up again. Just want to quote it exactly for you again. So Allah's messenger said, the hour will not be established until you fight with the Jews, and the stone behind which a Jew will be hiding will say, O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, so kill him. That is in Bukhari 452-177, also 452-176, and in Sahih Muslim 41-6985.
Yeah. Now, we once, there was a time when the Mormon faith said that the Mormon faith is an American religion that's tries to look like Christianity, but there was a time in the Mormon faith where they said that black people couldn't join their priesthood. They couldn't become members. Now that no one would dispute that is a racist ideology, or that, the idea that the Ku Klux Klan, for instance, believe that there's going to be a race war between white people and black people, and they project it into the future. They're saying it's not now, but it's coming, and there's going to be a war between white people and black people,
Yeah.
or white people and people of other non-whites, right?
Yeah.
That is an essential, what's the word I'm looking for?
Racist.
No, I'm talking about when something's in the future, not existential.
Apocalyptic.
Apocalyptic. There's another word for it.
Eschatological.
Eschatological. There we go. That's an eschatological hope of the Ku Klux Klan, is that there's going to be a race war and there's going to be the triumph of the white race over other groups. How is this any different? They have an eschatological hope that there will be a war between Muslims and Jews. And any Muslim who believes this has to believe, has to be willing, has to be ready to be that Muslim that when the rock calls out to them, they will come and kill the Jew.
Well, that is of course how it is preached in sermons, and the examples I gave to you, and there are many more as well. The imams preach it in a mosque and use it to incite people to violence in a sense, or to be anti-Semitic at the very least. And of course it was, the interesting thing is the Hamas Charter has some footnotes relative to this text as well. Let me just quickly bring that up a minute. So it says in the footnote that the Egyptian troops who launched the assault on Bar-Lev line in October 73, that's the Yom Kippur Wars now, not, were equipped with booklets of guidance that included this same quotation. And so, in other words, it's very interesting because the footnote to the Hamas Charter sort of, lends authority to it by saying this is the same hadith that the Egyptian troops used and were given in it.
Yeah.
And then another footnote says, Bukhari and Muslim are the authors of the two most authoritative, widely accepted collections of hadith or traditions of the Prophet. So, they are clear, they're very clear to explain this hadith is there because, it's authoritative and it's been used before and it's been used to help people who want to fight against, and this is
to inspire and encourage.
Yeah. And, hadith's own slogan is includes things like jihad is our way, and the Quran is our constitution, and dying for the cause of Allah is the greatest thing and stuff. They are full-on Islamists, aren't they? And then this is part of their justification by going to the Quran and the Hadith to justify exactly what they think.
Tim, why do you think it is important for us to point out to Western audiences that Islam is intrinsically anti-Semitic? Why even bother with that? Why is it even worth pointing that out? Aren't you actually just being Islamophobic by pointing that out? Like, why is it a valid thing to state?
Well, I think it's important to assess the claims of religions and to assess what religions are teaching and to expose and explain what religions are teaching. I'm interested in the truth. I'm interested in sort of, getting to which religion is true, which one is not true, and to, showing what religions actually teach and what they actually espouse. And, I think there's a massive contrast. I'm a Christian. I'm not a Muslim. I believe Christianity is true and Islam is false. And one way to show how Islam is false is to show exactly what it teaches and to show exactly what it's like and to show what Muhammad is like and what Muhammad actually taught and how Muhammad actually behaved. And, actually, when you expose this stuff, ultimately my motivation is to cause Muslims to rethink their faith, particularly cultural Muslims, or, who haven't really thought about it. And you say, did you know this is what Islam is like? This is what it actually teaches, what Muhammad is like. And for quite a lot of Muslims, they don't know because they're not encouraged to read the Quran in their own language. They're not encouraged to ask questions and so on. In the same way that Christians do encourage Christians to read the Bible and ask questions, in Islamic culture, they don't. And then to say, surely you should follow Jesus rather than Muhammad because, Jesus rose from the dead, Muhammad didn't. Jesus, for example, never handled a sword, and Muhammad did. Jesus healed people and never hurt anyone. Muhammad never healed anyone but hurt people, and so on, and say, surely you should rather follow Jesus than Muhammad. And for a lot of people, they never thought about it in those terms. And it's very good to explain it and to show people that this is what Islam, as judged by its texts, again, differentiate it from Muslims, many of whom do not know what the texts say because they're cultural Muslims, whatever. But Islam itself is intrinsically anti-Semitic, and the other side of this is that you can't understand the Arab-Israeli conflict without understanding that Islamic texts and Islamic teaching motivates anti-Semitism amongst Muslims, and that's a very important, significant factor in the whole Arab-Israeli conflict.
I think not just in the Arab-Israeli conflict, but also amongst the hate marches that we're seeing marching
Oh
in the
yeah, no,
streets of
good
London.
point. Yeah, I mean, also in the West, as an overflow of the Arab-Israeli conflict effectively into the streets and universities of Western campuses and Western culture, because we have such a significant portion of Muslims now in Western culture, we are seeing those same anti-Semitic sentiments expressed, and a massive rise in Islamic anti-Semitic attitudes and anti-Semitic expressions, particularly since the Hamas attacks on October the 7th. And this is not a coincidence. And my point is as well to say that anti-Semitism amongst Muslims is not just because of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It predates the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Yes.
It's more intrinsic to Islam than that. It goes all the way back to Muhammad and the Qur'an and the Hadith, and all the way through Islamic history, to be quite frank. And so the Arab-Israeli conflict in that sense is not new, or anti-Semitism is not a new thing, just came about in the 20th century, as you might be led to believe from the way the West portray it, and almost excusing Islamic anti-Semitism as, well, because of the Arab-Israeli conflict or something like that. Well, no, it's much deeper than that. They go back to the Quran to justify it, and you can provide lots of examples of that and so on.
Exactly. I mean, Europe had its first anti-Semitic pogrom in Paris just a few years back. That hardly made the news, though it should have.
Surely not the first pogrom ever in Europe.
No, it wasn't the first pogrom in Europe, but it's the most recent since the Second World War.
Right.
This was the most. It's the first time we've had an anti-Semitic pogrom in Western Europe since the Nazis, and it was a Muslim It was a Muslim anti-Semitic pogrom that attacked, like the anti-Christian pogroms that are happening in Egypt at the moment and happening in Pakistan right now. You've got these things, and it's like the liberal establishment just can't join up the dots.
Well, they don't want to. I mean, I think it's an uncomfortable truth, isn't it? That even Jews don't seem to want to recognize that Islam is anti-Semitic. Some of them do, of course. But the Western culture, we don't want to believe that there is an ideology, or that Islam is anything other than a peaceful, loving religion, because that's what we believe all religions are like, because Christianity is the only religion we have any real understanding of. I mean, I remember when I worked in the city, Bob, with very highly educated, Oxbridge educated people, and I said Muhammad was a warmonger and led lots of wars. They just didn't believe me. They just didn't believe me. What are you talking about? That he's a religious leader. Religious leaders are peaceful.
Everyone's like
by definition,
Jesus.
Almost by definition
all
in their
religious
mind.
leaders are like Jesus.
By definition in their mind, a religious leader must be a peaceful person. And you say, well, try looking at the text. Well, they're not interested. They don't want to know.
Yeah. And I think that the part of the reticence why the liberal establishment can't or won't join up the dots is because in their mind they can't make a distinguishment between Islam and Muslim. And so when me and you throughout this entire conversation have been talking about Islam, we prefixed it by stating this is not about what individual or groups of Muslims do. This is about what the texts teach.
Yeah.
But I guarantee that there'll be lots of lots of liberals who watch this, who every time we said Islam, they heard the word Muslim. And so this is part of the reason why our elites can't deal with this, is because there's lots of good Muslims out there who don't tap into this anti-Semitic narrative.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And they would be just as horrified of anti-Semitism as me and you would.
And part of my motive is to explain to them exactly what Islam is like, and to show them what they're following, and get them to look at the texts, which of course are now readily available on the internet for anyone to go and check for themselves, which is, causing many Muslims to revisit their religion and think about it, particularly if they've been Western educated and therefore taught by Western education to question things, to investigate things, to, you know, and then they can go and look up, then the Quran and the Hadith as well are readily available, easily accessible on the internet, and you can go and check it out for yourselves. And then they're asking difficult questions and quite often leaving Islam as a result. You know,
well, the other problem for us is the other problem for the West is that, as you showed from Palestine, bearing in mind that the Scottish government wants to import huge numbers of Gazans into the UK, is that if 73%, if 70-odd% of Gazans support Hamas, with Hamas's apocalyptic vision of a future war between Muslims and Jews, and the virulent anti-Semitism that Hamas has taught, and that means we're going to let's just imagine that the numbers hold consistent, that 70% of all the people that we bring over from Gaza are going to be rabid anti-Semites. They're going to be buying into anti-Semitism to some degree, and study after study
but
has
worse
shown,
than that, you know, but worse than that as well, because Hamas is now a prescribed terrorist organization as well, isn't it? You know, so it's you know, if they support Hamas, they are supporting a terrorist organization and sympathizing with terrorism, right?
So we're importing them.
You're importing people who are open to supporting, or, you know, and in some cases carrying out terrorist acts.
And the other point,
why did it take so long to prescribe Hamas as a terrorist organization? I mean, that's crazy.
It's a great question. It is a great question.
You've got their charter right there in front of you. You can go and Google it. Just read it for yourself. It's obvious. It's staring you in the face.
Yeah, it's because the liberal. The honest reason, I think, is because liberals just they're so filled with their own virtue signaling and so filled with their own worldview, they'd have no time to do any actual research of any deep or profound questions. One of the point that seems to have escaped public debate on this question is that if you are willing to tolerate Muslims here supporting terrorism over there, how long will it be before those same Muslims support terrorism here?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, yes, it's extraordinary how many, you know, we've had plenty of terrorist attacks here. And of course, the most recent one, is it right? The most recent one was probably the killing of Sir David Amess, MP, you know, assassination of an MP by a Muslim. But we've had dozens of foiled terrorist attacks, which don't obviously make the news anything like the same way. Had even a fraction of them succeeded, I wonder if our attitudes would be very different towards immigration and Islam and so on in this country.
I think that most people I think an increasing number of people in the general public have woken up, but we can't underestimate the power of the media to shepherd people's minds and thoughts. Like a terrorist attack after terrorist attack after terrorist attack, the media induces a come by our response. You know, let's not look back in anger that our children have just been blown up.
This is distortion of Islam. All this
Yeah,
stuff.
and so the biggest problem that we face is the sheer power of the media in covering up people's minds with a falsehood, basically.
Yeah. In fact, interesting, there's a government report that came out today or very recently on things that affect democracy, and Islamism is one of those things, and Islam is defined as having been invented in the 20th century, you know. So only in the 20th century have people actually believe the Quran and take
literally. Like the fact that Muslims of Muslim armies have marched for 1400 years straight without missing a single year into some Christian village or some Christian city or town or country somewhere, crying out Allahu Akbar whilst enslaving women and children and burning down and destroying churches. Obviously, you know, they must have misunderstood the Quran's injunctions, all of those Muslims, for 1400 years, you know. Anyway, it's been beautiful talking to you, Tim. Hold on, because I know we're going to have a chat after the live stream's finished. It's not a live stream, it's a recording. After the recording's finished. So I'm just going to close us in another prayer, in a psalm, and then I'll end the recording and we'll have a catch-up. Okay, so this is from Psalm 92. It is good to give thanks to Yahweh, to sing praises to your name. Most High, to declare your faithful love in the morning and your faithfulness at night with a 10-stringed harp and the music of a lyre. For you have made me rejoice, Yahweh, by what you have done. I will shout for joy because of the works of your hands. How magnificent are the works of your hands, Yahweh. How profound your thoughts. A stupid person does not know, a fool does not understand this. Though the wicked sprout like grass and all evildoers flourish, they will eternally be destroyed. For you, Yahweh, are exalted forever. For indeed, Yahweh, indeed your enemies will perish. All evildoers will be scattered. You have lifted up my horn like that of a wild ox. I have been anointed with the finest oil. My eyes look at my enemies. When evildoers rise against me, my ears hear them. The righteous thrive like a palm tree and grow like a cedar tree in Lebanon, planted in the house of Yahweh. They thrive in the courts of our God. They will still bear fruit in old age, healthy and green, to declare, Yahweh is just, he is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Amen.
Okay, I'll just end the recording. Thank you again.